All right, welcome to the Tabletop Miniature Hobby Podcast. It's Matthew with you here, fresh off a plane. I don't know if fresh is the right word for coming off a plane, but I've just been away on holiday to the Canary Islands, got topped up with some vitamin D, so that'll see me through the next decade of Scottish nuclear winters. And I'm joined by somebody on the southern hemisphere. It's Rob. How are you doing, Rob, today?
Hey Matthew, I'm doing quite well. I'm just coming out the other end of a family-sized cold with the kids, but we're all surviving and very happy to be here tonight.
So when I got back from my holiday, I was just catching up on the Discord channel, and there was a really cool thing had popped up, Rob, that you got a wee mention on. It was Wargamer.com, who'd picked up on a project that you've been working on and talked about it there. And a couple of members of the Discord were saying that it'd be really cool to hear about this on the podcast, and I wholeheartedly agree. So I appreciate you taking the time to come on and have a wee chat about it.
Yeah, no worries. I've been volunteered. I can hardly say no.
So this project is Acolyte, a Warhammer 40k kill team fan-made solo mode, and we're seeing here that it's inspired by Rangers of Shadowdeep, which listeners to this podcast will be no strangers to, and indeed they might not be strangers to Kill Team either, although it's not a game that gets a lot of airtime on this show with us basically living in the 90s, but I think this is really cool to hear about the meshing of the two. So would you like to tell us a wee bit more about the whole thing, Rob?
Yeah, sure. So as everyone is aware, we've lived through a strange few years, last couple of years. And down here in Melbourne in Australia, we had one of the world's longest lockdowns, kind of in and out for the better part of 2 years. And through that, one of the ways I was trying to stay a bit sane was playing. I set up like a weekly online game with my brothers, and we're playing kind of strategy, squad-based kind of things, BattleTech and Mechanicus, if the listeners know them, in a cooperative mode. And I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed, spending time with my brothers, even if I couldn't actually see them. And then we came out of lockdown, and my brothers are wargame lifers. I kind of fell out of it as a kid. I think I'm the same as all of your entire listenership, a man of a certain age who had HeroQuest and Space Crusade, and then discovered girls and guitars and so on, and bigger things in life. And then, you've got a bit more time when you're older and you've got kids and you start poking around the things you were into. And so it was harder to catch up with them. They were busier, but they're both wargamers. And so I was kind of digging around to say, well, what could we do together to maintain that kind of regular social thing? And I found Rangers of Shadowdeep, just Googling co-op wargames, and really, really enjoyed that. And through that, I kind of got back into the hobby. And one of the other things I discovered, which I really enjoyed, was the new Kill Team game, which is, I guess it's one of the fairly flagship Games Workshop games at the moment, but it's very different from a lot of their other stuff in that they kind of tore everything up and started again. It's an interesting modern rule set with a bunch of kind of compelling hooks to it that I really enjoyed. But I'm not really into the sweaty, competitive play against the person across you and try to crush them kind of gaming so much. And I missed that cooperative side that I really enjoyed in Rangers. And people would ask on the internet, do you think we could make a solo mode in this? And I was like, oh yeah, it'd be dead easy. Just take that stuff out of Rangers of Shadowdeep, whatever. And, I was putting up these replies for about 6 months, and then I thought, well, maybe I should do it. Put my money where my mouth is. And so had a bit of time on my hands at home looking after a baby. So while she was napping over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, I started kind of mashing all this stuff together, and it kind of spiraled out of control. And now I've got an elaborate solo cooperative adventure game built on a modern rule set that I put out into the wild, and it's kind of blown up.
Yeah, just looking at the feedback around it. So there was a Reddit thread that I was reading through. So like the response to it was like really positive, and especially in the Games Workshop realm, because there's just so many really engaged people, you're obviously going to attract a few dicks as well. So like I know that Games Workshop content, it's not always that positive around the discussion around it, but it just seemed to be like overwhelmingly positive. The responses that you got to that, did that surprise you?
Huge. Well, not that it was positive per se, but that there was a response at all. That I'd just kind of written this thing up in my own time to mostly to play myself, to try and convince my brothers to play. I may have said it in the post, or I said to someone, I wrote the game that I wanted to play. And I thought, look, I've written this thing. I may as well throw it up on Reddit and see if I can get any feedback. And I thought, a few people might look at it. And I think by now I've had about 2,000 downloads, something like that, which is wild. It's so far beyond what I expected I'd get out of it. But it seems like the game I wanted to play is the game a bunch of other people wanted to play, which is really kind of a rewarding feeling, I think.
So tell us a wee bit about the game itself, like the story world, if there is a story world, like what's the player sort of faced with and trying to do?
Yeah, sure. So if you are familiar with the Warhammer stuff, there's this, I don't know, it's not a battle between good and evil, because the whole the satire and the absurdity is that everyone's bad. There are no good guys. But there's this, you've got the Inquisition, which is kind of like the medieval witch burners, and they just rope people in to do their dirty work. And I've always been a lot more interested in that kind of grubby, low-level fantasy and sci-fi where it's just people scrabbling along trying to get by. So I thought, make a game where you're just a regular dude hopelessly out of his depth, being pushed into unpleasant situations and just trying to get by. So you are an acolyte to an all-powerful inquisitor kind of guy, and he's just sending you off to do grubby jobs that you may or may not come back from in one piece.
It's interesting that, like, we always talk about Games Workshop as the gateway, the big gateway for people. Like, they might get into Games Workshop or might have in the past, but now they're finding all these other games. It's pretty cool that you might have created a gateway, like, to Rangers of Shadow Deep, or vice versa,
Yeah, and I hope I have. I hope people go and follow the threads. It's funny. The very first draft I wrote up for myself, and it didn't make it into the one I put out because I felt I'd changed enough. Like, my opening paragraph was an apology to Joe McCulloch for just ripping off his work so shamelessly. But influences come from everywhere, and if you can send people to the things you like, I think it's a really useful thing to do.
Have you got any examples off the top of your head, like an event that might happen during the game, or like, are you doing the clue marker thing or anything like that?
Well, as an example, so for anyone who's played Rangers of Shadow Deep, the first scenario in the game I put out involves you going to a deserted settlement, looking for a guy who's vanished, investigating clues, and probably being eaten by zombies. It is shameless. It is absolutely shameless. But it's a really, like, I wrote that up just as a proof of concept, to be like, can I take this structure, put it on a different game system, teach toy soldiers to play themselves essentially with a little decision tree. And it worked, and it was a lot of fun. And that scenario is really good because it's so simple, and it introduces some really fundamental concepts like you have to get to this objective and look at this thing and reveal this thing, and the number of enemies are stacking up, but they're these kind of slow-moving, shambling things that are relatively easy to avoid. And it worked so well that I thought, I'll leave it in. It's a shameless nod, but it works.
Yeah. And you're obviously using the kill team rules because, like, is it like the kill team rules for like shooting and movement and stuff like that? It's just the framework is that narrative Rangers of Shadow Deep type. Scaffold, if you like.
The inspiration from Rangers is the AI, if you can call it that, the kind of primitive decision tree stuff, and I took that as a starting point, and then shuffled things around and added extra stages in to deal with more complex combat and objectives and so on. And the drawing cards for random events, that kind of stuff, which are great little ideas. And I don't know if they're Joe's originally, or they have been done in other games, because I was out of it for 25 years or so. I have very little idea of what's happened in game design since then, other than it seems like Games Workshop had done very little in games design since then until they came out with a couple of new games recently. But what I really like about Kill Team and why I built it on that is that it introduces a couple of really interesting mechanics that work really well for a game like this, for this kind of skirmish level RPG light kind of game where you've got characters that you want to care about and get a bit invested in. It's like Rangers in that it's everyone's got, you know, a bank of wounds or life or whatever. But the way it does combat is rather than just rolling one dice over and over and over again, like Games Workshop would do you, or rolling a d20 like you do in games like Rangers, which tend to be either interminable or incredibly swingy as ways of resolving things. Everything's done with pools of dice, 3 dice, 4 dice to attack, to defend, and you're doing multiple things. So something's always happening, which is satisfying. You're always doing a bit of damage. You're always taking a bit of damage and worrying about what the next hit's going to do to you. Combat is really interesting, the way they've designed it, and I've seen nothing quite like this. But, you know, I haven't looked around that much. But it's reciprocal, where both sides of the combat roll some dice and then you take turns damaging each other. And so getting into combat is a really sketchy, dangerous thing to do, which I think really works well with the theme of you're just a dude in a very scary universe. There's all these horrible monsters. Are you really willing to run up there and hit them with your stick? Or are you, just kind of terrified running around trying to do your mission and stay alive? And the other thing Kill Team does, which is probably the most complex, certainly the bit with the highest learning curve, is it has a really interesting cover system where whenever you move a guy around the table, you can choose to be engaged and shooting and fighting and whatever, or you can choose to be sneaking around, at which point you are, in a lot of circumstances, untargetable. And so it introduces these interesting opportunities for a stealth-based game that aren't really used in the base game because it's a competitive adversarial battle game, but I thought had a lot of potential for more of an adventure game where you might need to sneak in somewhere and steal something without anyone spotting you. So I've really enjoyed playing it, particularly in contrast to some of the other games I've been playing, which don't have those kind of levels of complexity and options in the tactical play, I suppose. So that's why I used that as a system, and then took the narrative and randomizing and self-playing procedural ideas from Rangers and tried to mash them together.
I want to ask you a wee bit about your sort of childhood hobby and stuff like that, but first, sort of just thinking like anecdotally from my point of view, when folks get back into the hobby, and again, this won't be like common across the board, it's just what I come across probably through this show. When folks get back into the hobby, they're tending to play like the older stuff, or they're finding non-GW stuff. So it's uncommon for me to come across someone who's come back in and is like doing stuff like Kill Team and that. You'll even come across folks that are really quite bitter and angry towards Games Workshop in their modern form. What's your kind of take on that? Like, you're obviously happy and glad to be playing a game like Kill Team. What's your sort of opinion on Games Workshop these days, and like the really fierce criticism that they might get from, folks that were into them back in the day?
Yeah, in many ways, I understand it and I sympathise with it. They are, a monolithic, huge, dominant entity, a massive corporation that I don't think treats their fans particularly well, or their. I think fans is a good term for it, given it's a fandom kind of thing. The way the games have gone, the way the IP has gone, I guess I'm not hugely interested in. That I dropped out late 90s, but it's. I mean, your listeners would know, people who've grown up with it, that the universe gets its hooks in you, and it's buzzing away in the back of your mind, and you think, I wonder what's going on there. And like you, I looked at one point I was like, oh, they blew up Warhammer Fantasy. Why did they do that? I always liked that. But they just, put a stick of dynamite in it and replaced it with this strange, bland, semi-high fantasy thing that has none of that human element. And yeah, look, I don't like the business model where everything gets bigger, everything gets better. There's massive scale and power creep. And so when I'm building things, and I've go on here, which is, really helpful for an audio format, but I'm building these little space cops who probably have an official Games Workshop name, but really they're just Judge Dredd ripoffs. And I remembered the metal ones from the 90s that I always liked but never had, and so I thought, I'll build myself some of those. But I didn't go and buy the new Games Workshop ones. There's some Stargrave bits, some 3D printed heads, some other odds and ends to try and capture that vibe. So I can see why people have a distaste of Games Workshop, and particularly how they approach kind of homebrew stuff as well. That over the last few years, they've scrubbed everything off YouTube. People were making fan videos. If they knew about this game, they'd probably scrub this off the internet as well, which maybe I'll have reason to be less pleased with them. But at the same time, the reason I grabbed hold of this game is not because it's a Games Workshop game. It's because I was poking around to see, I got back to it and I was like, I wonder what they're doing. And I looked it up, and a lot of it was, more of the same. Spend however much money on this giant thing or you won't win the game. Here's 8 new books that you have to buy to play. But there was this little game with really interesting rules, and I went, that actually sounds really compelling, regardless of who's written it. And at the same time, that universe is still buzzing around in the back of my head. So there's a bit of a hook there to be able to play in my own way in a setting that intrigued me.
Yeah, that's it. Like any sort of sci-fi rule sets that I've got, if we were getting the miniatures on the table, we would probably be playing in the 40k universe, or like a my twist on it sort of thing. I still really like that universe. Obviously, you've talked about the Age of Sigmar one, and that's not something I'm really interested in at all. But on the fantasy side of things, the Warhammer Old World as well is a brilliant set, and even if you're not using their rules or their old rules, so yeah, it's interesting. I think reasons that I've toyed with a game like Kill Team in the past without knowing very much about it is I know that I'd then be able to find plenty of folks to play, but then I don't actually have that much time to play anyway. So like I'm trying to get together with Robert again for another game. We're going to play Song of Blades and Heroes. So it's not like I even have, if I had a day a week where I was like, I'd really take a game, then I would probably get into something like Kill Team just to be able to go to like a local shop or something, a local club, which there will be some. So are you playing with modern miniatures, or are you using stuff from the olden days, if you like?
So I have nothing from when I was a kid. I gave it all to my brother, and he's still got bits and pieces of it, and occasionally something will float up to the surface, and I'll be like, I remember that. I half painted that and then gave up. But that red, I put that bit of red on. But everything I've got now is all new. So when I got back in, and this is like 9 months, maybe a year ago, I convinced my brothers to play some Rangers, and I enjoyed it. And I thought, maybe I'll try a bit of painting, see if I'm into it. And I bought a sprue of the Frostgrave soldiers off eBay, just 5 dudes and a starter paint set. And I was crap, but I was better than I was when I was 12, strangely. I guess just a bit more patience and a bit more capacity to kind of visualize what I wanted to do before I did it. And that got me, digging around. And there's all kinds of cool new plastic stuff these days. And what I really enjoyed with the Frostgrave things was having an idea of what I wanted my adventurers to look like. And I don't know if you've seen the Frostgrave plastic kits, or the Stargrave ones, they've got so many bits on them. You get, 5 bodies, but you get 20 heads and 20 different sets of arms and pouches and scabbards and shields. So you can really build the dudes you want to build. And I really, really enjoyed that. And I found myself, buying other little bits and sprues and cutting them and shaving them together. And so, yeah, I've just kind of been doing that since. The Frostgrave stuff, the Stargrave stuff. There's a great company called War Games Atlantic who make a lot of historics. And this is all, 28mm stuff. It's cheap. It's really, good quality. Really nice to work with. So all my stuff at the moment is that. It's new. It's plastic. And I've just really been enjoying kit bashing, I suppose, buying bits from all over and making the dudes I want to make. So, with these Space Cops, I had an image of what I wanted these guys to look like in my brain, which is Judge Dredd, essentially. I just wanted to build a little squad of Judge Dredd dudes to play my game, to play Kill Team, or a bit of Necromunda I've been playing lately, or Stargrave or something like that, and was able to, fish around between all the different manufacturers and find the pieces I wanted to put them together, and really been enjoying that process. And it's a lot cheaper than trying to find stuff from the 90s. Yeah,
aye, definitely. So you're saying it's 9 months ago, that's when you sort of came back into it all then?
Yeah. So, we played a bit of Rangers. I thought about, see if I liked painting. My second child was born and I was getting up at 4 a.m. every day and taking a baby out of the bedroom and getting her back to sleep so my partner could get some sleep. And I couldn't really turn the lights on and read or anything. And so I was looking for something to do on my laptop in the dark. That came out all kinds of wrong. Don't clip that, please. And I found a stash of old White Dwarf magazines. And I thought, I'll read these from the top. Started on issue 1 back in 1970, whatever. And they're a bit weird early, but I kind of got back into it through that way as well. And I read my way through the development of it. And, I really enjoyed the... I still am, I suppose. I'm still reading them. I really enjoyed like the early formative stages of the Warhammer stuff, where it's much more of a sketch with all these gaps that you can fill in. It's much more focused on the low level. You are just... You play as, just everyday people in a very scary, strange world that you don't quite understand because the people writing it didn't quite understand it either, and they just put the broad strokes in. So, that's kind of how I got back into it and what I've really enjoyed from it. And what I'm doing now is, for me at least, trying to recapture a bit of that DIY RPG light spirit of the early stuff.
How are you kind of staying informed about the medium then, like about the hobby? Are you reading certain websites? Are you getting any magazines, any other podcasts you're listening to? I mean, you'll learn nothing from this one, obviously.
Yeah. There's companies that I've discovered that I really like. So North Star, who do the Frostgrave and Stargrave models, they put out lovely stuff. So I follow them on Instagram, and I just keep an eye on what they're doing. War Games Atlantic, just see what they're putting out. You don't buy heaps of stuff, but occasionally they'll put out a kit, and I'll buy everything kind of by the sprue. So I only want 5 of these guys. I don't need a whole box. So buy bits and pieces like that. I keep an eye on the Games Workshop stuff. Because I'm kind of invested in the Kill Team rules now. And it's a living game system, I suppose. There's stuff constantly coming out. And I listen to a Kill Team podcast, which is perhaps even less informative than this one, called Kill Team Casuals.
That's hard to crawl under.
Well, they do their best. But yeah, and a lot of Reddit. Reddit's really good. I find, and you were saying earlier about, was I surprised by the positive feedback? And I said more the scale, because the miniature communities on Reddit are just lovely places. And I don't know if it's Reddit as a platform is just really good at upvoting nice people and downvoting awful people. Mm-hmm. But it's just a really supportive, positive environment where everyone is just, super stoked to see other people playing with toy soldiers and painting them and having a good time. So I spent too much time on there.
In my minimal experience of Reddit, it does seem to. I'm not saying this is true across the board, but it does seem to have a bit of a better atmosphere. People on there generally seem to be a bit more human than some of the other cesspits you come across. Twitter, Facebook.
I think it's something about the technology, the whole upvote, downvote, and promote things that people like and hide things that people don't. It filters, but it also encourages a particular kind of behavior, I think.
Yeah.
That it's like, well, what's the point in me being a jerk if it's just going to vanish? I may as well say something nice or say nothing at all.
Yeah. Before we get on to what you were up to when you were wee with the hobby, what paints are you using these days? You doing any painting at all?
Yeah. I don't have as much time to do it as I'd like, and I'm quite a slow painter. When I got back in, I bought a Vallejo starter set because they seemed like they were meant to be decent paints and good value, and I've had really good experiences with them. So I've mostly got those, and a few of the Citadel washes and a couple of contrast paints that I've just used for not in the slather everything in contrast paint, quick painting style, but more for tricky stuff like trying to get glowing eyes and that kind of thing. I found they were really good for that because you can kind of pick out the dynamics you want just in black and white on a model, and then put the contrast over it. So there's I've got a fluoro green and a fluoro orange one that have been really good just for those really bright sections. But otherwise, I still paint like I did when I was a kid, which is drab colours and slather the whole thing in black ink and hope for the best.
Yeah, I am the same. I think what changes as an adult is, like you were alluding to before, your planning is a lot better, and you've got I'm not saying we've all got loads of disposable income, but you do at least have some money to plan to buy something. Whereas I do remember as a kid in the White Dwarf catalogues, it was like, I'm going to buy all of that and I'm going to buy all of this. And I clearly wasn't, because I'd never ever.
You had an exercise book with 10 different armies written down in that you would never ever going to own.
This is what I'm getting, and
And that's another reason I got really into the skirmish stuff. That as much as we've got disposable incomes now, we don't have disposable time. When you're a kid, you've got all the time in the world and no money to fill it with. Now, we've got jobs, we're comfortable enough, but finding the time to play games, to glue things together, to paint things, if you only need to put 10 dudes on the table to play, it's just so much more realistic and feasible than. And I know some of the guys in the Discord are like, no, mate, I need hundreds, I need thousands of models. This is what I wanted as a kid. This is what I'll have now. But I'm like, it's less about the spectacle and more about the social side of it for me. So just being able to get something I'm happy with on the table. If it's 10 dudes, it's 10 dudes, and I'm really happy to be able to do that.
Yeah, I am the same. I'm mainly skirmish based for that reason. I still do love to see the pictures of people who have the balls basically to put these huge armies, these big blocks of troops. I love to see it.
Not naming any of your guests who can convince their wives to knock a wall through and build a massive table.
Yeah,
I'm sympathetic as well. I can't remember his name, but you had the guy on who was, I think he ran a 6 or an 8 mil company a while back.
Yeah, Peter. Yeah, Bacchus.
Yeah, and he
Bacchus
made I think a really valid point that the size of table people play 28 or 32 mil mass combat games on isn't big enough. That to have a really good game, you need enough space to have movement and tactical options and being able to flank and whatever. And if you're just wall-to-wall dudes on both sides and you're marching at each other, it's a less interesting experience. So if you're able to have a 15-foot table, fantastic, build a massive army. But the space you have available to play in as well, I think, is a determining factor, whether it's quantity or the scale you play at.
Yeah, I am still working on some 6 mil stuff. I basically got a load of miniatures from Bacchus, and the idea was to I think it was basically an army box, like a single army, and I divvied them up, and I think I've got, say, 7 units each, fairly balanced. There's a bit of difference just to make it interesting, so it's not a game of chess. So I aim to have a game of that within the next couple of months at least. I'm going to use the Mayhem rules. Brent Spivey's Mayhem book looks really good for mass battles, so that'll be something that I'll be talking about in a future episode.
Yeah, nice.
And get my rank and flank fix at last.
we had I forget what it was called. One of the epic Warhammer games when we were kids, the sci-fi ones, and yeah, I've been enjoying reading the old White Dwarfs because I'm up to 1989 or so when that was just released, and they've got these pictures of these massive armies, spread out with tanks and infantry and giant robots, and it is a really it's really nice to see. There's I don't know what the word I'd use is, but it's really striking to see those massive armies on a table, and so I can definitely see the appeal there. But at the same time, I'm what I find really satisfying in the painting is getting all the bits I want to make the guy that I can imagine in my mind and getting the pose. And I find 28 mil is a really good scale for that. Even though when I first bought those Frostgrave guys, I was like, oh my god, these are so tiny. These are so much smaller than I remember. Turns out my hands were smaller when I was 12. But yeah, I feel like 28 mil is almost like a good natural scale for painting and gaming, because you can get a good amount of detail without having the demands of going up to 35, 56 mil, whatever, where they start to get into like proper big toy soldier territory. But I'm also I'm sympathetic to those space demands of you want to play a big rank and flank Waterloo game or Ancients or Fantasy or whatever. There's that appeal to being able to put a huge army on the board. And there's a guy on the Discord for this pod as well who's doing really interesting things with the magnetic travel cases. I don't know if you've seen those. He's getting tool cases and board game cases and things and building scenery within them and playing sort of 15 mil travel games, which is really interesting as well, because it makes you shrink the space a bit and it suddenly becomes incredibly portable.
Yeah. It's cool to see what folks get up to, what they build and what they create. I think that's a great part of coming back in when you're a bit older and got some life experience. You come up with ideas and things to try and actually go and execute them. Or, as a kid, you spend a lot of time talking about going to do something and rarely actually do it. So, going back to when you were a kid, then talk us through like getting into the hobby initially. How did that come about?
So yeah, I think like your entire listenership, HeroQuest. We had HeroQuest and Space Crusade as kids. My dad had been I'd say you'd call it a historic wargamer now, but it was Second World War, and he would have played in the 60s and the 70s, so it was pretty much contemporary then. But there were always these boxes of like 1/72 tanks and trucks and whatever squirreled away in the shed. You'd open something and a whole army would spill out. So I was aware that toy soldiers were a thing. And yeah, we had HeroQuest, we had Space Crusade. We'd go to... I grew up in Glasgow, and we'd go to visit my grandparents down in London. They lived right near a Games Workshop, so we just wandered down there and pretty much just as tourists, just gawk through the windows and all this stuff. So we had those games. We'd play them as a family, and got a few of the plastic box sets, the early ones. So my brother was a bit older, or my brother still is a bit older because that's how time works. Um, and so I guess he was probably doing most of it. We had the Marines with the pointy helmets, the first lot, and we had the skeleton army, where these fiddly little things, but there was a chariot and there were cavalry, and then just like a few metal bits and bobs around the edges. Never enough to really play a game with, other than those more family focused board games. And then, when I got a bit older and you started getting birthday money and an attention span and so on, I'd split the big Games Workshop boxes with my older brother. So we had 40K second edition, and we had one of the Epic games, I think. And so, it was a bit of that, and you actually start to play, and like going back and reading the rules now, particularly the early stuff, completely impenetrable. That I have no idea how a 7-year-old thought he had any idea what was going on in that game. But I have fairly vivid memories that we were actually playing things. And I think as well that what kind of informs my nostalgia about it is that, as much as when I was starting to buy stuff with my own money and paint things, it was that classic 90s Games Workshop where everything's bright red and blue on Goblin Green. A lot of my exposure came from much older copies of White Dwarf that we'd get from the local library, which was the strange, old, messy, rogue tradery stuff, weird conversions, rules that made absolutely no sense, background stuff that you legitimately could not print these days because it got very sketchy. The kind of things a 7-year-old probably shouldn't be reading. But that kind of weird early phase as well is what stuck in my head, I think, and why when I've been going back and reading them, getting back into it now, that kind of grubby, low-level, scary, unknown universe is the bit that most appeals to me, and the absurdity and the humour and the blackness that's in there, that's kind of been sanitized out to some degree today, but also all the gaps have been filled in as well. So there's much less DIY, both in terms of the hobby and the universe, I suppose.
There was in the Discord, if I just do a bit of this makes great audio, there was a interview with Rick Priestley on another podcast. I might have to find it and put it in the show notes.
If you jump on your podcast app and you Google him, he's been on a bunch and they're all fascinating. He's really interesting to listen to. For anyone who doesn't know, Rick Priestley is pretty much the guy who invented Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. If not the entirety of the rules, certainly the universe. So really influential there.
5 Games from Doomsday, it was, the podcast. So I've heard Rick on a few other podcasts, but this one seemed to me, like in the few that I've heard, this was the most insightful in terms of the origin story of Warhammer and the lore and stuff like that, and how it developed and how sort of piecemeal it was at the time, and his opinions on where it went from there, and how he kind of parted ways with the company. It was really, really good. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. 5 Games from Doomsday. Have you read? Did you read Dice Men at all?
No,
the Livingston and Jackson book.
I haven't seen it, but as I've been catching up, I have been following up these threads, reading interviews and listening to them, and there's a really interesting side to it that Priestley talks about, where he says, well, the reason the 40K universe looks like it does is because nobody thought it would sell. And they said, we're not going to make any models for it. So it's got to have orcs, it's got to have elves, it's got to have dwarves, because that's what we've already got. It's got to have cops who look like Judge Dredd, because we have the license for Judge Dredd and already make those models. And so I think in a way it makes it a much more familiar and relatable universe in a way. As much as it's authoritarian, dystopian, horrific far future, it's got all these cultural touchstones in that are kind of embedded in our psyches as lifelong fans of fantasy or sci-fi. And it just kind of falls together into something that works.
I always thought when I was wee, like, is 40k, is that the Warhammer world 40,000 years in the future? It's obviously, like, it's meant to be this galaxy 40,000 years in the future, this world. But I just thought with the orcs and that, like, there must be a continuity there.
Well, if you go back far enough, there were attempts to kind of reconcile the two. That the fantasy world is somewhere in there. That for whatever reason it's kind of cut off from everything else. But I think they gave up eventually. Like, nah, let's stop. Let's stop trying to make this work. Who cares? It's fantasy. It doesn't.
That's a good
sense.
homebrew. Like, I'm taking like 5 space marines and we're going to fight this massive high elf army. But
well, if you go back far enough, there's not that distinction, and this is like the wildness of it that really appeals to me. It's like they have this role-play adventure where it's like you are a bunch of Vikings raiding these South American frogmen's temple, and you break in there and you dig down far enough and suddenly you find a golden chest full of laser guns that the space aliens have left there. And so there is that kind of overlap built into it, at least in the early stages.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then when it gets to that early 40k stuff, and I read the Rogue Trader rulebook out of curiosity and also because it was 4 a.m. And then I listened to some Rick Priestley interviews, and he talks about how it is essentially a medieval world where the whole thing runs on, blind faith and fear and an oppressed peasantry, just extrapolated up to an entire galaxy. And there's a lot of, the interesting parts of it to me are that same grubby scrabble for survival in a kind of sketchy, superstitious, culturally historic setting like the old Warhammer stuff, the old world stuff.
Just swinging back to Acolyte then, as we kind of run out of time here, Rob.
Yep.
Are you any other plans to write anything else from it at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm plugging away at it. Just so when I first put it up, it was just a proof of concept. Like, does this AI model work? Is it fun to play? And now it's kind of taken off and say, oh crap, I've got to make a real game out of this. I've got to fill in all the gaps and complete this and make it playable, particularly if I'm going to convince people to play it with me. Because to this point, I've only play tested it on the kitchen table with kids' toys for enemies and terrain and paper tokens and piles of books. So yeah, I'm working on a few things at the moment and putting in more enemies and monsters and more missions, that kind of thing. And I've got some ideas. But what's been really inspiring is I made a Discord for it, and a bunch of people have been enjoying it. They jump in, they share their games, but they've also started writing rules and talking about writing their own adventures. And so, you make a cool thing and you stick it out in the world and people like it enough, they'll make cool stuff using it as well. So that's the best case scenario, is I don't have to keep writing stuff on it because other people will.
Yeah, it gets that life of its own and just takes off, yeah. And then Joe McCulloch can't sue like 20, 30 people, can he? So, and Games Workshop as well. Imagine they both came at you from either end.
Yeah, that's the problem. I don't own any of the rights to any of this. So, put it out for free. You were talking about AI in a couple of episodes ago, and it got a bit weird at the end with Skeletor and whoever else.
Yeah.
But it's a free game, and I thought I'd try and make it look nice. So I was putting AI art on it as well, because at least nobody's going to sue me for that. But yeah, we'll see how much life it has when somebody who actually has a claim to it decides that maybe you're not allowed to do this. I have no idea what the legal status of it is at the moment. Hopefully, it's too small for anyone to notice, but it's been a lot of fun in the meantime.
Great stuff. Where can the listener go and get themselves a copy of the game?
So I've got a link tree for it. The address is linktr.ee, linktree/Acolyte game. There's the rules on there. There's a link to the Discord. A link to my profiles where I talk about it a bit. So if you want to, jump on there and have a look around, fantastic. And I post a bit on the Kill Team Reddit when I put a new release in as well, because that seems to be where the people who are most into it lurk, other than on the Discord for the game itself.
Great stuff. I'll put links in the show notes too, so the listener could find it that way. And
fantastic.
Wishing you all the best for it, and just great to see you having some success with it, and another wee cool game out there for folks as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. As successful as anything you do for free can ever be.
Yeah, aye. Labour of love.
Like this high-earning podcast of yours.
Yeah, I know. That's how it went on holiday last week. Multi-millionaire now.
That Patreon's really paying off. I noticed you stopped plugging it though, so I figure you've earned enough from it.
Yeah, I forgot, to be honest. I forgot about it. It sounds terrible, but I went in there and there was enough for to get a pizza and a couple of beers. So I think you fire a few bob in there yourself. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, I think the 2 beers might be my subscription, so you're welcome.
I can't even remember the URL. Was it bedroombattlefields.com/worst Patreon or worst Patreon ever? It was something like that. I'll put links in the show notes to that as well, seeing as I'm in a linky show notes mood. Thanks very much, Rob. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me on here. It's been great.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. We'll get you back on once you get sued, and we'll talk about the legal case and how you're going to defend yourself.
How Games Workshop destroyed my life.
Cool. All right, Rob. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.